In the early years of the 2000s in the quiet college town of Las Cruces, a tragedy unfolded that would change not only a family, but an entire nation's approach to violent crime. It began on a warm holiday weekend, an evening meant for friends, celebration, and laughter, yet it ended in a way no one could have imagined. Before we begin, please take a moment to like, comment, and hit the subscribe button. Your support helps Buried Secret Media continue telling the stories that deserve to be told. This is the case of Katie Sepic, a daughter, a sister, a student, a leader, and the law that now bears her name. Catherine Katie Sepic grew up in the sun-drenched city of Carlsbad, New Mexico, the oldest of 3 siblings. From the very beginning she was a force of nature. Her father described her simply, a ball of fire from day one. She wasn't the type of child who quietly blended into the background. She was bold, energetic, playful, and always in motion. Katie had a vibrant personality, loud, spirited, and unafraid to stand out. She put on shows for her family, teased her siblings, and had a natural talent for making even the ordinary feel like an adventure. Her humor was sharp but never cruel, and she had the gift of laughing at herself in a way that drew people closer instead of pushing them away. As she grew older, Katie maintained that same spark. She joined a sorority, built lifelong friendships, and found her identity in leadership and determination. She earned her business degree from New Mexico State University and was preparing to begin graduate school, setting her sights on a Master of Business Administration. Her ambition was as strong as her personality. She knew exactly what she wanted and she wasn't afraid to chase it. To her sister, she was the adventurous one, always planning something new, always steering the group with confidence. To her friends, she was the fun one, the one who made every moment brighter. And to her family, she was a guiding light, full of promise and unshakable energy. Katie had her entire future ahead of her, but she would never get to live it. In the summer of 2003, Katie's life was busy and full. She was balancing school, a job as a waitress, and a relationship with her boyfriend of 8 months, Joe. The two deeply cared for each other, but they were navigating a difficult chapter. Katie was about to begin graduate school, and Joe was preparing to move several hours away to work in his family's business. Their futures were beginning to pull in different directions. Still, for Labor Day weekend, they decided to put their worries aside and enjoy a night out with friends. The group moved from bar to bar, dancing, laughing, and soaking in the final nights of summer. Security cameras captured moments of the couple holding hands, quiet proof that despite their struggles, there was still affection between them. As the bars closed, the group headed to a house party, joining roughly 30 to 40 people. The music, the alcohol, and the late hour blurred the edges of the night. But within the chaos of that party, everything would begin to unravel. At some point during the night, Katie witnessed something that shattered the fragile peace she and Joe had created. She saw him kissing another woman. Shock turned to anger. Anger turned to heartbreak. And in the middle of a crowded party, the couple argued, loudly enough for others to notice. After the confrontation, Katie made a decision that would change everything. She left the house alone, sometime around 3 o'clock in the morning. She didn't take her phone. She didn't take her purse. And she didn't take her keys. She simply walked into the night. Her home was only a few blocks away, a short walk under normal circumstances. But this was not a normal night. She was upset, vulnerable, and heading into the darkness without a way to call for help. It was a moment of heartbreak, a moment of frustration, a moment no one expected to be dangerous. But it was the last moment anyone saw her alive. When the sun rose over Las Cruces, the mood at the house party was entirely different from the night before. People woke up disoriented, replaying half-forgotten memories from the evening. But it didn't take long for someone to notice what was wrong. Katie had not come back. Her car was still parked outside. Her belongings were still inside. And no one had heard from her. Her roommate, Tracy, quickly realized the seriousness of the situation. She called friends, called hospitals, and checked their home. Katie's bed was untouched. Tracy's mother, who was staying there as well, hadn't heard anything during the night. Katie had vanished. And at almost the same time that her friends were making frantic calls across the city, another set of calls were being placed. Calls that involved something discovered miles away, in a deserted patch of land just outside town. No one yet knew that both investigations were connected. Around 11 o'clock that morning, a couple out hunting near an old dump site spotted something on the ground. Something pale, still, and unmistakably human. The body of a young woman lay partially burned, abandoned in the desert. Officers arrived quickly. The scene showed clear signs of violence and a deliberate attempt to destroy evidence. The body was left in a remote area seldom traveled, the kind of location chosen by someone who wanted their crime to go unnoticed. There were tire tracks, burn marks, and disturbing signs that the victim had been posed. The desert heat was rising quickly, threatening to erase valuable evidence with every passing hour. At that point, the victim had no name. It would not be long before investigators discovered it was Katie. News of the body in the desert traveled quickly, and investigators soon made the connection between the missing young woman reported earlier that day and the remains found near the dump site. But before the police could confirm anything publicly, they needed someone who knew Katie to identify her. Katie's roommate Tracy agreed to come in immediately. At first, she thought the police simply needed her to verify that Katie had been located somewhere safe, perhaps at a hospital, perhaps confused or without her identification. She walked into the room expecting relief. Instead, she walked into her worst nightmare. When investigators pulled back the top of the body bag just enough for her to see, Tracy immediately recognized her friend, but the sight was so haunting, so painful, that she later said it did not look like the Katie she knew. It looked like someone who had suffered. Someone whose final moments were filled with terror and struggle. From that moment forward, the case officially shifted from a missing person report to a homicide investigation. The medical examiner began a meticulous examination of Katie's body. Every detail mattered, and every detail told a piece of the truth. The findings were devastating. Katie had been sexually assaulted. She had fought back fiercely, blood and DNA beneath her fingernails proved it. She had been strangled. A flammable liquid had been poured over her back and shoulders. A fire had been started, but for reasons unknown, it extinguished before fully burning her body. Investigators quickly determined that Katie had not been killed at the dump site. There were no signs of a struggle there, no disturbed soil, no footprints indicating a physical fight. She had been taken elsewhere, attacked closer to her home, then transported in a vehicle to the desert. One heartbreaking detail stood out above the rest. Katie had a naturally husky voice. Even when she tried to scream, only a faint, airy sound came out. She had lived her whole life with this limitation. And in her final moments, no matter how desperately she tried to cry out, she may not have been heard. It was a fact that settled heavily on everyone involved in the case. Investigators turned their attention to Katie's home. Behind the residence, they found what would become one of the first clear indicators of what happened that night. The back window screen had been torn. The gravel below was disturbed. And one of Katie's sandals lay on the ground as if it had fallen, or been pulled, off during a struggle. It was clear she had tried to get inside through the back window. And somewhere between arriving home and making it through that window, something, or someone, intercepted her. The timeline began to take shape. Katie left the party around 3 o'clock in the morning. She walked the short distance home. She reached her back window. And then she encountered her killer. In cases like this, investigators start with the people closest to the victim. There was no avoiding the obvious first step, questioning Joe, Katie's boyfriend. Joe agreed to speak with detectives, but the conversation quickly raised concerns. His story changed. He struggled to explain his actions. He contradicted himself on small details. He downplayed the argument at the party. And he admitted that he had cheated on Katie that night. Even more troubling was his behavior afterward. He told police he had searched for Katie by driving past her home, but when he didn't see the light on in her bedroom, he didn't bother stopping. He said he assumed she was teaching him a lesson, a comment that baffled investigators and friends alike. And despite knowing she was missing, he left town just days later to return to his family. Then came the most suspicious action of all. He refused to provide a DNA sample. Out of nearly 40 people who had attended the house party, Joe was the only one who declined. Investigators couldn't force him without probable cause, and his lawyer, already involved, instructed him to say nothing more. Given the circumstances, an argument, infidelity, strange behavior, and refusal to cooperate, Joe became the prime suspect. Friends found it confusing. Katie's family found it heartbreaking. And detectives found it deeply troubling. But they needed evidence. And as they would soon learn, the truth was much more complicated than anyone expected. Katie's funeral drew more than 1,000 people. The church was so full that speakers had to be set up outside to accommodate everyone who came to honor her. Friends from school, from childhood, from sorority life, and from work all gathered to pay their respects. Professors attended. Neighbors attended. Even community members who had never met Katie attended, moved by the tragedy that had shaken the town. But one person was notably absent. Joe. He chose not to come, claiming he wanted to avoid conflict and respect the family's wishes. It was a decision that left many confused and unsettled. Investigators watched from a distance, taking note of the vehicles parked outside the church. Tires were checked discreetly, hoping for a match to the tracks found near the body. Nothing matched. Once again, the case seemed to be slipping through their fingers. Eventually, investigators made a discovery inside Katie's bedroom. Biological material confirming that she and Joe had been intimate recently. This allowed them to obtain Joe's DNA legally. That DNA was compared to the samples taken from Katie's body. And the results were definitive. Joe was not the killer. After more than 2 years of suspicion, unanswered questions, and emotional turmoil, the person investigators had focused on from the beginning was officially eliminated. Detectives expressed frustration, not because Joe was innocent, but because his refusal to cooperate had cost valuable time. Katie's father said the same. They could not get those years back. And now, investigators were left with the hardest place to return to in any case. A dead end. No suspects. No leads. No direction. Only the truth that Katie's killer was still out there. As time passed, the case grew colder. Investigators had combed through every detail of the night Katie died, interviewed anyone who might know something, and pursued leads that took them across the country. But nothing connected. Nothing explained what happened. And nothing brought them closer to justice. Even when a similar attack occurred in Wisconsin, where a woman survived a brutal assault 11 days before Katie's death, the DNA did not match. The cases shared eerie similarities, but the attackers were identified and convicted. They had nothing to do with Katie's murder. Once again, investigators were back to nothing. But what no one realized then was that the break they needed, the one that would blow the case open, was about to come from an unexpected place. A crime that happened just 9 weeks after Katie's murder. A crime involving a man who had already crossed the justice system once. A man who slipped through the cracks because of a law that would later bear Katie's name. And that mistake would change everything. By the time 2 years had passed since Katie's murder, the case had settled into an uneasy quiet. Detectives still worked leads, but each one dissolved into nothing. The community still remembered her, but the urgency that once filled the air had thinned with time. Katie's family clung to hope, but hope alone could not solve a case. Las Cruces had returned to its normal rhythm. College students walked the same routes Katie once did. Cheers from football games echoed across campus. Life, slowly and painfully, moved forward. But the truth was always there, just beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. And that moment began 9 weeks after Katie was killed. It started in a quiet Las Cruces apartment complex where 2 New Mexico State University students, Anela and Leslie, lived. On this particular night, the 2 young women had settled in like any other. Their apartment was small but comfortable, the kind of place that feels safe simply because it's familiar. But in the early hours of the morning, something disrupted that sense of security. A sound, soft, subtle but unmistakable, came from the living room area. It wasn't loud enough to signal a break-in, but it was unusual enough to draw their attention. They listened. The noise grew. Someone was inside their apartment. The man who had entered wasn't stumbling drunkenly or rifling through drawers in search of valuables. He moved with intention. He had watched them before. He had waited. And now he had chosen his moment. Terrified, the 2 women locked themselves in the bathroom and called emergency services. Their voices were shaking, barely coherent, but they managed to explain that someone had forced their way in. Police responded immediately. And because of that fast response, the 2 women survived. The intruder was arrested on the scene. His name was Gabriel Ayla, a 23-year-old man with a cold, unsettling presence that left investigators uneasy. He was charged with aggravated burglary with the intent to commit aggravated assault, a serious felony. Under typical circumstances, he would have remained behind bars until trial. But what happened next was a decision that still confounds investigators and the Sepic family to this day. The judge granted him bail. Not just that, he was released so he could get his affairs in order. And once he walked out of custody, Gabriel wasted no time. He fled. By the time authorities looked for him again, he was already across the border in Mexico. And because he ran before his conviction, one crucial thing never happened. His DNA was never collected. In New Mexico at that time, as in most states, DNA was taken only after a felony conviction, not upon arrest. This legal gap meant that Gabriel remained invisible to the national database. If the law had been different, Katie's case could have been solved in a matter of weeks. Instead, Gabriel vanished for nearly 2 years. In 2005, Gabriel reappeared. He attempted to re-enter the United States, perhaps thinking too much time had passed, or that his case had been forgotten. But border officials caught the outstanding warrant immediately. Gabriel was arrested on the spot. He was brought back to New Mexico, where he finally faced trial for the burglary and assault-related charges. By 2006, he was convicted and sentenced to 9 years in prison. For most offenders, this would have been the end of the story. But for investigators in Las Cruces, this was the moment everything changed. Because once he was processed into the prison system, something routine happened. A single cheek swab. A tiny sample of DNA. 1 minute of procedure. And then, that sample was uploaded into the national database. No one expected what happened next. A match appeared. In law enforcement systems, notifications like this are stark and unemotional. A simple digital alert, a name, a number. But what that alert represented was extraordinary. The DNA beneath Katie's fingernails, the DNA she fought to capture in her final moments, belonged to Gabriel Ayla. For the first time in more than 2 years, investigators had a name. A real suspect. A real direction. The shock was immediate. Gabriel was not connected to Katie in any way. He was not someone from her social circle. He wasn't a former partner or a scorned acquaintance. He wasn't a jealous ex or a co-worker with an obsession. He was a stranger. A dangerous man who crossed her path by pure, devastating chance. The odds of him encountering her at that exact place at that exact moment were almost impossibly small. Investigators later said, if Katie had walked home 30 seconds earlier, or 30 seconds later, she might still be alive. But fate placed Gabriel in her path. And Katie became his victim. Once the DNA match was confirmed, investigators turned their attention to Gabriel's life outside prison. They contacted his estranged wife, who had filed for divorce after his burglary conviction. She helped in ways she never anticipated. She told investigators that she had found a ring in Gabriel's truck some time earlier, small, delicate, and out of place. She didn't know what it meant. But detectives did. The ring belonged to Katie. It was one of the last items missing from her body. That piece of evidence alone was damning, but investigators wanted the full picture. They tracked down the pickup truck Gabriel had owned at the time of Katie's murder. Although he had sold it years earlier, the new owners had kept the original tires. Those tires were compared to the tracks found at the desert dump site. The match was perfect. The timeline was clear. The evidence was overwhelming. And the truth could no longer be questioned. After years of searching, the identity of Katie's killer was no longer a mystery. It was not Joe. It was not a jealous acquaintance. It was not a roaming serial offender from another state. It was a stranger, a man who had already shown a willingness to harm women, a man who slipped through the system because of a legal gap. And now, with the evidence stacked firmly against him, Gabriel would finally face the consequences of what he had done. This discovery marked a turning point, not just in the case but in Katie's legacy. Because what followed would change the laws of New Mexico, influence federal legislation, and ultimately help solve countless cold cases. Katie's death would lead to something powerful, something that saved lives. But before the law could be changed, the truth of what happened that night needed to be heard. And soon Gabriel would confess. Once Gabriel Ayla was confronted with the overwhelming evidence, DNA beneath Katie's fingernails, tire impressions, items taken from her, and the clear timeline linking him to her final moments, he finally broke. In a confession that investigators would never forget, he described the night Katie died. He said he had been driving through the neighborhood early in the morning, having just left the home of someone he went to for drugs. The roads were quiet. The night was cold. And as he turned down a familiar street, he saw Katie walking alone. He claimed that he nearly hit her with his truck, that he stopped, got out, and offered her a ride home. According to him, she refused. She was only a short distance from her house, and she told him she could make it on her own. He drove off. But minutes later he returned. He saw her standing near the back of her house, struggling with the window screen, trying to get inside without her keys. To him she looked vulnerable, tired, upset, alone. And in those moments, Gabriel said something inside him snapped. There was no motive rooted in jealousy, revenge, or personal history. He didn't know her name. She had never seen him before. There was opportunity. And he acted on it with horrifying speed. He attacked her outside her home. He assaulted her. He strangled her. And when she fought back, fought harder than he anticipated, he transported her body to the desert, attempting to burn away the evidence. He left her there, posed and alone in the sand. His confession aligned with the physical evidence in a way that left no room for doubt. Investigators had always believed Katie fought until the end, leaving behind the very evidence that would ultimately identify her killer. It was the truth no one wanted, but the truth everyone needed. With Gabriel's confession secured, the case moved swiftly into the final phase. On the day after Christmas, which would have been Katie's 26th birthday, Gabriel was officially charged with murder, kidnapping, rape, and tampering with evidence. For Katie's family, the timing felt both brutal and symbolic. Justice was moving. But it was happening on a day that would always be tied to who Katie was, and who she should have become. The district attorney, determined to hold Gabriel fully accountable, refused to offer plea deals that would lessen his charges. She made it clear, this was a case that could not be lost. Too much time had passed. Too much damage had been done. And the evidence was overwhelming. In May of 2007, Gabriel pleaded guilty to first-degree murder, rape, kidnapping, and evidence tampering. Before sentencing, he asked to address the Sepic family. He said he was sorry. He said he didn't know why he had done it. He said he never intended for things to go as far as they did. Katie's father saw some remorse in his words. Her mother said she forgave him, not for his sake but for her own peace. But forgiveness did not erase justice. The judge sentenced Gabriel Ayala to 69 years in prison. He would not even be eligible for parole until the year 2043, and even then the chances of his release were considered extremely unlikely. The courtroom closed that day with a sense of finality. Justice had been delivered. But something far more important was only just beginning. Katie's family refused to let her story end with grief. They wanted to make sure that what happened to her would not happen to others. And when they looked back at everything that had gone wrong in the investigation, the delays, the years spent chasing the wrong suspect, the long silence caused by one man's refusal to cooperate, they discovered the one detail that could have changed everything. If Gabriel's DNA had been collected the night he broke into the apartment of the two college students, Katie's murder would have been solved within weeks. But because DNA was taken only after conviction, not upon arrest, Gabriel's profile remained invisible. Katie's mother, Jan, began researching state laws nationwide. She studied cases where early DNA collection could have prevented violent crimes. She discovered countless stories of offenders who were arrested repeatedly, but not convicted, and whose crimes escalated because their DNA had never been taken. One example stood out: a man in California who had been arrested more than 20 times before finally being convicted. Once his DNA was collected, it matched evidence from more than a dozen unsolved murders. Jan realized something painful but powerful. Katie's case was not an isolated tragedy. It was part of a larger pattern, a pattern that needed to change. So she and her family took action. Jan and her husband Dave committed themselves to reform. They met with lawmakers, advocated for policy change, and built partnerships across the state. Their message was simple: collect DNA upon felony arrest. Save lives. Prevent future tragedies. In 2006, Katie's Law went into effect in New Mexico. It required DNA collection from anyone arrested for a violent felony. The law was later expanded to include all felony arrests. The impact was immediate. Cold cases began reopening. Longtime offenders were finally identified. Victims gained answers after decades of silence. The success of the law gained national attention. Katie's Law spread across the country. Eventually, 31 states adopted similar legislation. The United States Senate passed a nationwide version of the law, and President Barack Obama signed it into federal policy. Katie's death had become the catalyst for a transformation in forensic justice. Her family created a nonprofit, DNA Saves, to continue educating the public and lawmakers on the power of DNA evidence. Their mission was clear: turn tragedy into protection for countless others. They would never know the names of the people saved by the law. But they knew the number was real, lives that continued because of Katie. For her younger brother AJ, Katie had always been a guardian. A sister who performed family shows, teased him, protected him, and stood by him like a second mother. Losing her felt like losing a part of himself. Her sister Caroline said she remembered everything after Katie's death with painful clarity, but without color. As if the brightest light in her life had suddenly gone out. Her mother Jan learned to stop saying "what if?" Not out of acceptance but out of survival. She chose instead to focus on what could be changed, and she did. Today across the country, cold cases continue to be solved because of the law named in Katie's honor. Offenders are taken off the streets. Innocent people are protected. And families receive answers they once feared would never come. Katie's story remains one of deep loss, but also one of extraordinary impact. Her life ended far too soon, but her legacy continues to save others. When Gabriel Ayala was led away in handcuffs after sentencing, many believed the story was over. The man responsible for Katie's suffering was gone. The courtroom had spoken. The law had given its judgment. But the aftermath of a murder never ends with a gavel. For the Sepic family, healing would be slow, painful, and non-linear. Grief lived in their home like a silent, unwelcome guest. Birthdays became anniversaries of loss. Holidays carried the weight of what should have been. And ordinary days became reminders of an extraordinary young woman whose life had been taken much too soon. Katie's mother once said that losing a child was like losing a piece of your soul, something that can never grow back. And yet, somehow life must go on. But moving forward doesn't mean forgetting. It means transforming pain into purpose. And that is exactly what Katie's family did. In the months that followed Gabriel's sentencing, the Sepic family was approached by parents, students, lawmakers, and victims of crime who had followed the case closely. People wanted to help. People wanted change. Jan and Dave realized they had been placed in a position they never asked for, but one they could not walk away from. They had seen firsthand what a delayed DNA match could cost. They had lived through years of uncertainty, frustration, and fear. And they knew other families would face the same reality unless something changed. So they became advocates, not just for Katie, but for countless victims whose cases depended on modern investigative tools. They traveled to hearings and legislative sessions. They spoke on the steps of government buildings. They met with law enforcement agencies across the country. They sat on panels, gave interviews, and offered resources to families in similar situations. Their message spread far beyond New Mexico. Katie's story became a national call for forensic reform. With the passage of Katie's law, New Mexico began to see immediate improvements in unsolved cases. Police departments reopened files from the 80s and 90s, cases that had sat untouched for decades because they lacked a suspect or a direction. Hair, fibers, clothing, and biological evidence stored in freezers for years were finally tested against modern databases. Matches began appearing. Cold cases warmed. Families received long-awaited answers. Some of these victims would have remained nameless statistics, lost in old evidence boxes, if not for the new law. Word of the law's success spread to other states. Legislatures across the country adopted similar statutes, recognizing the power of DNA collection upon felony arrest. Eventually, the movement reached Washington, D.C. Members of Congress referenced Katie's story during federal hearings. They discussed the thousands of unsolved violent crimes nationwide and the potential to identify serial offenders long before they could strike again. By 2011, President Barack Obama signed a federal version of Katie's law, incentivizing states to collect DNA from felony arrestees. In the years that followed, the law helped solve murders, sexual assaults, and abductions across the United States. Katie's life and her family's courage became a force that protected others. Today, more than 3 decades after Katie's death, her influence remains deeply felt. The law bearing her name continues to solve cases every year. Police departments still cite the law as a foundational tool for forensic investigations. And families who once believed justice was impossible now receive answers they never imagined they would hear. Katie's legacy lives in every solved case, every prevented crime, and every life saved from a predator who would have otherwise gone undetected. Her story has been shared in classrooms, forensic seminars, victim advocacy groups, and law enforcement training programs. She is remembered not just as a victim, but as a catalyst for change. For Katie's siblings, the loss shaped their lives in ways they still struggle to articulate. Her brother AJ remembers her as both a sister and a protector, a role she embraced wholeheartedly. He recalls childhood performances where Katie insisted he be her backup singer, and the way she shielded him from anyone who tried to bully or intimidate him. Her sister Caroline, much younger at the time, said her memories of life after Katie's death are vivid but colorless, as if the world lost its brightness for a time. She describes her sister as a light that illuminated everything around her, a light that could never be replaced. Her parents, Jan and Dave, have dedicated their lives to ensuring that Katie's story inspires safety, justice, and change. They carry her memory into every courtroom, every legislative battle, and every public speech. And through their tireless work, Katie's story has touched far more lives than she ever could have imagined. It is easy, in true crime narratives, to become overwhelmed by the details of the investigation, the timelines, the suspects, the evidence, the legal proceedings. But at the heart of every case is a person. Katie was a daughter, a sister, a friend, a student, a dreamer. She was ambitious, funny, bold, and full of life. She had plans, goals, and a future she was ready to build. Her life was taken by a man she didn't know, in a moment that should never have happened. But her legacy, through her family's perseverance and the laws created in her name, has saved others from a similar fate. Katie's story is one of tragedy, but it is also one of transformation. A single act of violence ended her life, but her legacy has protected countless others. As we reflect on Katie's case, her life, and the impact she continues to have across the country, we honor her memory by ensuring her story is remembered, not only for the tragedy but for the change it inspired. If you or someone you know has been affected by violent crime, remember that you are not alone. Advocacy groups, victim support services, and legal resources are available to help you find answers and healing. As we reach the end of Katie Sepic's story, we find ourselves returning to a question that haunts every case of senseless violence. How does one moment, one intersection of two paths, change everything? Katie didn't know Gabriel Ayla. She had never spoken to him. She had never crossed him or wronged him or even noticed him. She was simply walking home after a painful argument, trying to reach her bed, her room, her safe place. And in those few quiet seconds, their paths crossed. A single moment in the darkness. A stranger on a street. A life shattered. A family changed forever. This is the brutal truth behind so many tragedies. Sometimes there is no reason, no motive, no explanation that can ever make sense of the loss. But Katie's story does not end in darkness, because her family refused to let it end that way. Katie's parents, Dave and Jan, have said many times that they would give anything to have their daughter back. But since they cannot change what happened, they devoted their lives to changing what could happen to others. Their advocacy reshaped state policy. Their daughter's name moved through legislative halls. And the law inspired by her experience continues to close cold cases, identify hidden offenders, and bring long-awaited justice to families who thought the world had forgotten them. Katie's law exists today because one family turned unimaginable grief into a national movement. Her story now lives in every forensic classroom, every DNA lecture, every investigative training session where officers learn how to catch offenders faster, prevent future tragedies, and protect those who would otherwise become victims. Katie's life was cut short, but her legacy extends far beyond the years she lived. Katie's mother once said she had to stop asking, "What if? What if we had known sooner? What if the law had been different? What if someone had been there to hear her? What if she had walked home a little faster, or a little slower?" Those questions bring no peace. So instead, she began asking a different question. What can we change now? Through that question, Katie's name became a catalyst for thousands of solved cases. Families who once waited decades for answers now have closure because of a law inspired by a young woman with a bright spirit and limitless potential. And that is why Katie's story matters. Not just because of the tragedy but because of the transformation. It is easy to focus on the crime, the investigation, the evidence, and the trial. But this case is not defined by a killer. It is defined by a life. Katie was outspoken, vibrant, hilarious, and full of fire. She brought joy to everyone around her. She dreamed of success. She dreamed of family. She dreamed of changing the world. And in a way no one expected, she did. Through laws. Through reforms. Through justice. Through the thousands of victims whose cases were solved because of the work done in her name. Katie's life continues to create ripples, long after she is gone. The story of Katie Sepic is a reminder of the fragility of life, how quickly it can change, how suddenly a moment can become a turning point. But it also reminds us of something deeper. That even in the darkest chapters, human courage can create extraordinary light. Katie's family transformed heartbreak into hope. They turned pain into progress. And they ensured that no family would endure the same uncertainty they did. Her story lives on, not only in the courtroom, not only in the laws, not only in the database hits across the nation, but in the hearts of everyone who hears her name. As this documentary comes to a close, remember this. Every statistic has a story. Every cold case has a family. Every tragedy has a name. And every life, even one cut short, can change the world. Thank you for watching this episode of Buried Secret Media. If Katie's story moved you, if you believe in justice, in truth, and in keeping these stories alive, please take a moment to like this video, leave a comment, and subscribe. Your support allows us to continue honoring victims, telling their stories, and shining a light where darkness once stood. From all of us at Buried Secret Media, thank you for joining us. And thank you for remembering Katie.